The 19th century was an age of wonders and contradictions, a time when the Victorian world was both enthralled by progress and haunted by superstition. Steamships and telegraphs shrank the globe, while gaslit streets illuminated bustling cities. Yet amid this march toward modernity, the darker corners of society harbored an insatiable fascination with the grotesque, the peculiar, and the extraordinary. It was the golden age of the freak show, when human difference was paraded not as a subject of compassion, but as a spectacle of amusement and profit. Traveling circuses, carnivals, and sideshows promised audiences the chance to witness nature's strangest mistakes and God's most baffling creations. Posters shouted promises of marvels: the bearded lady, the giant, the living skeleton, and the wild man of Borneo. Each act was a mixture of truth and exaggeration, science and myth, exploitation and entertainment. Into this peculiar marketplace of oddities emerged one of the most curious attractions of all, the so-called boy with 3 legs. His story was whispered in taverns, printed in broadsides, and carried across England by the eager tongues of those who had glimpsed him beneath the striped tent canvas. He was a living paradox, both a child and a commodity, both pitied and admired. Was he a medical marvel, the result of rare deformity, or a cruel invention of promoters desperate to outshine rival attractions? In a world where fact and fantasy blurred with each painted poster, the truth was never easy to find. The boy with 3 legs did not live in isolation, but within the spectacle of a booming entertainment industry that thrived on human difference. The freak show was not merely diversion, it was big business. Audiences paid their pennies, filed into makeshift halls, and pressed close to the platform, eager for the thrill of astonishment. Men in bowler hats and women in bonnets stared wide-eyed, some giggling nervously, others recoiling in mock horror. Children whispered questions their parents refused to answer. And there, in the center of it all, the boy stood as both wonder and warning, proof of nature's unpredictability and man's relentless appetite for profit. The Victorian age was obsessed with cataloging, classifying, and displaying. Museums collected exotic animals and foreign artifacts, while the human body, especially when marked by visible difference, was treated as another specimen for public consumption. Surgeons peered at the boy with clinical fascination, scribbling notes as though he were a living textbook of abnormality. Preachers thundered that he was a sign of divine punishment, while showmen painted his image on lurid posters to lure larger crowds. For the boy himself, the reality was harsher: long hours beneath the glaring eyes of strangers, a childhood spent not in games or schooling, but in display. Yet behind the spectacle lay a human being, someone whose story forces us to question not only the morality of a bygone era, but the ways in which society still treats those who do not fit its narrow idea of normality. In the rigid moral order of Victorian Britain, where progress and propriety walked hand in hand, the appearance of a child born with extraordinary difference was met with both horror and fascination. Medicine, though advancing, had yet to explain the mysteries of congenital deformities with precision. Terms like monstrosity or aberration filled medical journals, and each new case was documented with clinical curiosity but little compassion. Families faced agonizing choices when confronted with a child whose body defied the expected form. Some concealed them in shame, others abandoned them to poorhouses or hospitals, and a few, perhaps driven by poverty, perhaps by desperation, saw opportunity in what others called misfortune. It was in such a climate that the boy with 3 legs first entered the world. His extra limb, strange yet functional in part, placed him beyond the ordinary boundaries of society. To his family, he was both a burden and a potential source of survival. To neighbors, he was a spectacle to be whispered about in the marketplace and gossiped over by candlelight. Soon enough, word of his condition reached the ears of showmen, always eager to discover living curiosities to thrill paying crowds. The boy's difference was no longer merely a personal matter. It was transformed into currency. Before long, He was lifted from the privacy of his home into the public glare of the freak show stage, a child recast as an exhibit in the traveling theater of oddities. The boy's introduction to the world of spectacle was shaped less by his own will than by the demands of an industry that thrived on exaggeration. His promoters framed him not as a child with a medical condition, but as a wonder of nature, a living miracle who defied explanation. Posters and pamphlets did not speak of deformity. They spoke of marvels. Brightly painted bills proclaimed him the only boy on earth with 3 perfect limbs, or a gift from Providence. See the child of nature's secret. The truth, of course, was more complicated. The third leg, likely the remnant of a parasitic twin or an incomplete duplication, was not as strong or graceful as the advertisements claimed. But in the world of Victorian showmanship, truth mattered little compared to the power of spectacle. The child himself was given little say in how his life unfolded. He was dressed in costumes designed to highlight his difference, placed beneath gaslight on wooden stages, and trained to display himself in ways that accentuated the curiosity of his body. Sometimes he was asked to run or dance, demonstrating his extraordinary balance. At other times, it was enough simply to stand while the audience gawked. The boy was not merely living. He was performing his very existence. Thus, from the moment of his birth, his body became his livelihood, his identity molded less by who he was and more by what others saw in him. Behind the applause and the coins dropped into the showman's hand lay a harsher truth, that the boy's extraordinary birth had condemned him to a life where he would be forever measured, not as a person, but as a phenomenon. By the mid-19th century, the freak show was no longer a fringe curiosity, but a thriving industry woven into the fabric of Victorian entertainment. It stood shoulder to shoulder with circuses, music halls, and traveling theaters, attracting both the working poor and the rising middle classes. For a penny or two, the public could step into a world of marvels where human difference was sold as both education and amusement. At the heart of this economy was marketing, a showman's ability to transform an individual's anomaly into a story so compelling that crowds would flock night after night. Promoters of living curiosities knew the value of spectacle. They commissioned bold lithographs and posters, splashed with lurid colors, to plaster on pub walls and market corners. Newspapers carried sensational reports of the latest attraction, often exaggerating or outright fabricating details to draw larger audiences. The boy with 3 legs was advertised not as a child with a condition, but as a once-in-a-lifetime wonder. "Behold, the marvel of all Europe," proclaimed one handbill. A youth unlike any other, born with nature's secret gift. The boy's true story mattered less than the narrative crafted around him. His difference was polished, staged, and sold, until his identity was no longer his own, but a commodity traded between promoters and audiences. Within this world, profit reigned supreme. Managers and showmen measured the value of their performers in shillings and ticket stubs. Success meant constant touring, from smoky London halls to dusty provincial fairs, and sometimes even across the Atlantic to America, where T. Barnum and others built empires on the backs of such attractions. For the boy with 3 legs, the stage became his permanent home, his body the foundation of his economic worth. The scale of the freak show economy was staggering, and its organization surprisingly modern. Contracts, though often exploitative, were drawn up to bind performers to promoters, and disputes over profits were common. Some human curiosities became celebrities in their own right, commanding high salaries and performing before royalty, while others remained trapped in poverty, their earnings siphoned by unscrupulous managers. For child performers like the boy with 3 legs, the latter fate was far more common. His wages, if any reached him at all, likely went straight into the pockets of adults who controlled his appearances. He was, in effect, both child and property, his body a resource extracted for the benefit of others. Audiences, meanwhile, rarely questioned the system. For them, the freak show was a thrilling diversion, a chance to confront the strange and the shocking within a safe environment. To see the boy with 3 legs was to brush against the mysterious limits of nature, and for a brief moment, to feel both superior and unsettled. This uneasy mix of fascination and fear was the secret ingredient that fueled the industry's success. Showmen understood it well and crafted their presentations to heighten both wonder and unease. Gaslights were angled to cast dramatic shadows, curtains pulled back at just the right moment, and patter delivered by barker or manager stoked the imagination before the audience even glimpsed the performer. Thus, the freak show economy thrived on a simple formula: find the unusual, frame it as extraordinary, and sell it to the masses. And as long as the crowds paid their pennies and the managers counted their profits, boys like the one with 3 legs remained caught in its machinery, living wonders on stage, but commodities off it. The moment of revelation was the heartbeat of the Victorian Freak Show, and no performer understood its power better than the managers who orchestrated every glance, gasp, and murmur. For the boy with 3 legs, the spectacle began long before he stepped into the glare of the lamps. Outside the tent, painted posters promised marvels beyond imagination. Inside, a barker's booming voice whipped the crowd into anticipation. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare to witness a wonder of nature, a youth unlike any ever seen, a boy with not 1, not 2, but 3 living legs. By the time the curtain pulled back, the audience was already primed to marvel, to scoff, to fear, or to laugh. The performance itself often required little more than the boy's presence. Simply standing on the stage, dressed in clothes designed to highlight his anomaly, was enough to draw gasps and whispers. But to heighten the drama, showmen devised routines. Sometimes he would walk back and forth, the third limb swinging oddly beside the others. Sometimes he was asked to run, to dance, or to balance in ways that suggested an almost supernatural agility. Whether the extra leg was strong or limp, partial or complete, mattered less than the illusion that it gave him powers beyond ordinary men. Each movement became a demonstration of difference, each step a reminder that he was not like the crowd that stared at him. In those moments, the boy was less a child and more a living spectacle, a body transformed into theater. While the stage presented a world of wonder and applause, the reality behind the curtains was far less glamorous. For the boy with 3 legs, the moments between performances were often marked by exhaustion, confinement, and a lingering sense that his life was not his own. Audiences might have imagined that he lived as a star, pampered for his unique gift, but the truth was harsher. Like many performers in Victorian freak shows, he was bound by the will of his promoters, who viewed him less as a child than as property. His earnings were rarely his to keep. Most of the money flowed into the pockets of managers, showmen, and theater owners who profited from his difference. Life on the road meant endless travel, from the grime of London's music halls to the muddy fields of country fairs. Lodging was often cramped and uncomfortable, sometimes in dingy boarding houses, other times in makeshift wagons. Meals were irregular, sleep disrupted by constant movement, and privacy nearly non-existent. He lived in close quarters with other performers, some adults who had long grown weary of the gawking crowds, others children who, like him, had been thrust in a spectacle without choice. Bonds of friendship sometimes formed among these unlikely companions, but so too did rivalries, as performers competed for attention and favor from the showmen who controlled their destinies. Yet perhaps the heaviest burden was psychological. Away from the crowd's cheers, the boy confronted the reality that his body, the very thing that set him apart, was also the reason he had little freedom. Every mirror reflected not just his difference, but the reminder that he was trapped by it, living a life dictated by the appetites of strangers. If the freak show stage transformed the boy with 3 legs into a spectacle for the masses, the medical halls of Victorian Britain transformed him into a specimen for science. Surgeons, anatomists, and physicians regarded his body not as a child's, but as a puzzle, a rare opportunity to examine what they called deviations of nature. The 19th century was an era obsessed with classification and taxonomy. Just as explorers cataloged exotic animals and plants from distant colonies, doctors cataloged human difference. Each anomaly carefully described, sketched, and debated in journals and lectures. For the boy, this meant that his performances did not end when the curtain fell. On certain days, he was brought before groups of gentlemen in stiff coats and spectacles, instructed to stand still while they measured, prodded, and questioned. Doctors argued whether his third leg was the remnant of a parasitic twin or the result of abnormal embryonic growth. Some claimed it hinted at undiscovered laws of heredity. Others dismissed it as a random deformity. Whatever their theories, few saw beyond the physical form. They rarely spoke of the boy's feelings, his life, or his struggles. To them, he was evidence, not experience. These medical encounters were often as invasive as the stage. Sketch artists drew his body in meticulous detail, capturing angles that highlighted the strange limb. His likeness appeared in pamphlets and medical reports, circulated among professionals and curious laymen alike. Each image, each description, added to the mythology of his condition, making him both scientific subject and sideshow advertisement. What made the medical gaze so powerful in Victorian society was its ability to cloak spectacle in the language of authority. While the freak show barker promised wonder and entertainment, the surgeon promised knowledge and truth. Yet the boundary between them was thin. Many physicians themselves were enthralled by the freak show and often visited exhibitions to examine performers firsthand. In some cases, showmen even arranged special private viewings for doctors, turning medical scrutiny into yet another source of profit. Thus, the boy's body was never free from examination. Whether by laughing crowds or solemn scholars, his difference was always under glass. The scientific attention also shaped public perception. Newspapers eagerly published extracts from medical reports, framing the boy not only as entertainment, but as a living mystery for science to unravel. Respectable Victorians who might have avoided the vulgarity of the sideshow felt justified in attending when told that such displays held educational value. In this way, the medical gaze legitimized exploitation. It gave the freak show a veneer of respectability while stripping the performer of humanity. For the boy himself, the intrusion blurred the line between life and dissection. He was alive, yet treated as though already consigned to the anatomy table. Some doctors hinted at the value his body might hold after death, speculating that a full autopsy could unlock answers to nature's secrets. Imagine the burden of growing up under the shadow of such words, knowing that both the stage and the lecture hall regarded your body as property, a curiosity to be studied and consumed. In the eyes of science, as in the eyes of spectacle, the boy with 3 legs was less a person than a phenomenon, defined not by his humanity, but by his anomaly. What made the medical gaze so powerful in Victorian society was its ability to cloak spectacle in the language of authority. While the freak show barker promised wonder and entertainment, the surgeon promised knowledge and truth. Yet the boundary between them was thin. Many physicians themselves were enthralled by the freak show and often visited exhibitions to examine performers firsthand. In some cases, showmen even arranged special private viewings for doctors, turning medical scrutiny into yet another source of profit. Thus, the boy's body was never free from examination. Whether by laughing crowds or solemn scholars, his difference was always under glass. The scientific attention also shaped public perception. Newspapers eagerly published extracts from medical reports, framing the boy not only as entertainment, but as a living mystery for science to unravel. Respectable Victorians who might have avoided the vulgarity of the sideshow felt justified in attending when told that such displays held educational value. In this way, the medical gaze legitimized exploitation. It gave the freak show a veneer of respectability while stripping the performer of humanity. For the boy himself, the intrusion blurred the line between life and dissection. He was alive, yet treated as though already consigned to the anatomy table. Some doctors hinted at the value his body might hold after death, speculating that a full autopsy could unlock answers to nature's secrets. Imagine the burden of growing up under the shadow of such words, knowing that both the stage and the lecture hall regarded your body as property, a curiosity to be studied and consumed. In the eyes of science, as in the eyes of spectacle, the boy with 3 legs was less a person than a phenomenon, defined not by his humanity, but by his anomaly. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the golden age of the freak show began to wane. What had once been a staple of Victorian entertainment, paraded across dusty fairgrounds and gaslit stages, was slowly eroded by changing sensibilities. The very forces that had first elevated the boy with 3 legs into a spectacle now began to dismantle the world he inhabited. Industrial progress had transformed Britain's cities, creating new diversions for a growing middle class. Cinematographs, wax museums, and music halls offered amusements that were novel yet less morally questionable. The appetite for human curiosities, while not extinguished, faced competition from forms of spectacle that did not rely upon the exploitation of living bodies. At the same time, reform movements cast a critical light on the treatment of those displayed in sideshows. The growing humanitarian spirit of the late Victorian period, inspired by religious reformers and social activists, questioned whether it was just to treat men, women, and children as little more than curiosities. Campaigners for disability rights, though not yet called by that name, argued that difference should be met with compassion rather than ridicule. Medical men, too, began to withdraw from the public stage, preferring to study anomalies within the confines of hospitals and anatomical museums rather than share their interest with paying crowds. What had once been billed as educational entertainment was increasingly denounced as cruelty. For performers like the boy with 3 legs, this decline was double-edged. It meant relief from some of the harshest forms of spectacle, yet it also meant the collapse of the only livelihood they had known. As the crowds dwindled and the tents emptied, many once famous curiosities faded into obscurity. Some sought refuge in medical institutions, where their conditions became subjects of private study rather than public wonder. Others returned to poverty, left behind by managers who no longer found profit in their uniqueness. The boy with 3 legs, whose identity had been forged on the stage, faced the same uncertain fate. Without the constant gaze of spectators, who was he? Could he live as an ordinary man in a society that had never seen him as ordinary? Or was he doomed to vanish into the margins of history, remembered only as a name on a handbill, a face on a yellowing poster? For a few performers, there was survival in adaptation. Some reinvented themselves as lecturers, speaking against the very shows that once displayed them. Others joined traveling circuses, where the emphasis shifted from human oddities to animal acts and acrobatic feats. But for most, anonymity was the final chapter. The decline of the freak show did not erase the stigma of difference. It merely removed the stage upon which it had been displayed. By the dawn of the 20th century, the boy's world was nearly gone. The freak show had become a relic of an earlier, less civilized time, condemned by reformers, yet preserved in memory as part of the strange theater of the Victorian age. The boy with 3 legs, once hailed as a marvel of nature, became instead a ghost of a bygone entertainment economy. A reminder that the line between fascination and exploitation is always thin, and that societies which gaze too long at difference often fail to see the humanity behind it. The boy with 3 legs may have disappeared from the stages that once defined him, but his story lingers as more than just a Victorian curiosity. He embodies a broader legacy, the way societies have historically treated those whose bodies fall outside the narrow lines of normality. In the freak show, his humanity was eclipsed by his anomaly. He was celebrated not as a person, but as an exhibit, his identity reduced to a single feature. Yet this very reduction reveals something profound about Victorian culture. Its hunger for order and classification, its simultaneous fear of and fascination with difference, and its willingness to turn human lives into entertainment. Today, the boy can be seen as a mirror held up to an age that was both progressive and cruel. The Victorians built railways, telegraphs, and empires, yet they also stared at children like him as though they were curios in a cabinet. His story underscores the paradox of the era, the pursuit of knowledge and progress entwined with exploitation and dehumanization. In him, we glimpse the shadows of a society that measured worth not in humanity, but in novelty, and which blurred the line between compassion and commerce. Though his name may not be preserved in history's ledgers, his figure remains symbolic. The boy with 3 legs is less an individual now than an emblem of countless unnamed performers whose bodies were displayed for profit. He stands for the silenced voices, the hidden lives, and the forgotten children who lived not for themselves, but for the gaze of others.